Have you ever wondered what it takes to build a brand new game like this from the ground up? Well, today we're down here in Frankfurt, Germany, visiting Deck 13, the studio behind the Surge 2. And on this special episode of Digital Foundry, we're talking to many of the engineers behind this new game to better appreciate the techniques and tricks used to bring this world to life. We'll be examining everything from the volumetric fog systems, the new lighting systems, the decals, and how they've managed to optimize to get such a game like this running at 60 frames per second on the enhanced consoles. All that and more is coming up on this very special edition of Digital Foundry. Let's get started.
The Surge 2 is an action RPG in the vein of Dark Souls or Neo, but with a sci-fi twist. The first game took place in and around a large industrial facility, with lots of tight corridors and interiors, but the sequel greatly expands its scope to a much larger urban environment known as Jericho City. With an increase in scale and detail over the original game, the underlying technology also required changes to match this new direction.
In the recent years, third-party engines such as Unreal and Unity have become increasingly popular in the development community, but some studios such as Deck 13 have continued to refine and improve their own in-house technology.
Back in 2009, we started developing our own multi-platform engine, Fledge. It's currently in the, I think, 4th generation for the Surge 2.
The game is created here in this medium-sized office, housing a passionate group of coders, designers, and artists. Common tools such as Maya and Photoshop are prevalent, of course, but it's Fledge which brings everything together. Fledge, like any game engine, is a framework of tools and technologies designed for game production. Unreal Engine has become hugely popular over the last 20 years or so with its vast array of tools and features already implemented and ready to utilize. And the editor itself is an abstraction layer of sorts, which allows artists and designers to directly work with technical features in an efficient manner. Creating tools such as this from the ground up is a huge task, but building such a development platform and refining it is precisely what Deck 13 has focused on over the years. But why build an in-house engine to begin with?
For us, the reasons to use an in-house engine are very diverse, I would say. So we had a lot of issues just using middleware in the past. So for us, it's actually the worst thing to think of to use something that's completely in the hands of a different company. So we really love to create custom tech for certain use cases, and that's actually something that fits this company really well, is to very quickly adapt systems to how we are actually working, to create tools that fit certain use cases in the art department, for example, or to create tools we like to work with.
It all started 10 years ago.
When we started with Fledge, we did our first multi-platform title, which was called Blood Knights, very unknown online store title. But then we started developing Lords of the Fallen, also for the last generation back then. And in the middle of the development, the new generation of consoles were announced. So we had the opportunity to directly go for that now current generation of consoles.
Lords of the Fallen was released less than 1 year into this generation of consoles. It had its fair share of performance issues, but it was a promising start with some impressive technical features, including an advanced particle simulation and ray-marched volumetric lights. But it was the next project that really put them on the map.
The project after that was obviously the Surge 1, which was also tech-wise, I think, quite an improvement. So especially performance-wise, finally we managed to get a stable 30 FPS over the whole game, but also later added the 60 FPS versions for the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X.
The Surge was a solid offering. No new boundaries were pushed necessarily, but it offers stable performance, detailed visuals, and a very small file size. It's optimized and tightly made. But even then, the team felt that they could make some significant improvements going forward.
And actually, even for lots of the Fall and the Surge, we struggled a lot to hit our performance goal on the consoles. But they already had the potential to farm more stuff on optimization side to actually leverage the hardware in the end.
Which is where the development of the Surge 2 comes into focus. The team has continued to improve and optimize, but with the same performance goals as the previous game, yet more detailed, large-scale visuals. The road ahead would prove challenging. The question is, what were the design goals on the engine side, what new features were implemented, and how far could the consoles really be pushed?
There was the idea from design side to go to a city, and rendering a whole city is a much more demanding task for the rendering engine than just rendering an industrial complex with a lot of indoors.
This is one of the first challenges the team faced then. The objective was to create a larger world. While the Surge 2 is not an open world game, rendering the finer details of an urban landscape at a larger scale is not a small task. Thus, one of the key changes made to increase efficiency and speed is the shift to a more powerful graphics API. You've probably heard of things like DirectX, OpenGL, Vulkan, and the like. These are graphics APIs, or application program interfaces. These serve as an intermediate layer between the GPU and the software, allowing programmers to more effectively utilize hardware features. One of the reasons DX12 and Vulkan have become increasingly popular is due to the new features enabling lower-level access to hardware while still providing that all-important interface layer. When used properly, it can greatly increase efficiency.
We decided to move to the latest generation of graphics APIs, so-called Vulkan and D3D12. And yeah, we made a couple of improvements, I think a lot of them, but especially it made it much more easy for us to control every aspect of the performance, especially on console.
If you take a look at our PS4 rendering backend, for example, we actually took the step. There's this rendering API which is called GNM or GNMX. On the PS4, GNMX is more something that's a little bit more high level to aid developers to get quickly started with the API. So that's what we actually used for the Surge. But for the Surge 2, we actually went all the way using the new rendering tech to utilize the full power of GNM.
So the Surge 2 makes full use of the latest APIs to improve efficiency, allowing the team to further improve its set of rendering features without sacrificing performance. And the result is an attractive, sleek-looking game world with a focus on futuristic architecture combined with scrap metal and bare wires. There's more variety here than the original game for sure, with lots of small shortcuts to open and much to see as you fight your way through the enemy. But how is this world created, and how do you make it fast? Well, it starts with the assets themselves, which are crafted using tools such as Maya. This is where the bulk of the world is designed, modeled, and laid out, basically. And this is what it might look like. This is basically a chunk from one of the game's stages as viewed through Maya. Modeled objects can be fully manipulated and pieced together to effectively create what you see. Let's take a closer look at this chunk of world geometry and you get a better idea of how the designers can work with the scenery mesh itself. It's possible, for instance, to quickly make changes, including copying, pasting, and combining already modeled meshes to create something entirely new, such as placing this sort of window awning thing into this section of the stage. And here's another example. The designer can move these wall meshes here and utilize other objects such as these piles of rubble to build something else entirely. It's typical stuff, no doubt, but this is where a lot of the primary level design work happens. The result then is a series of large meshes and objects that can be imported into Fledge, where designers can then properly place everything and connect everything to the game itself. With so many highly detailed objects, however, it can be difficult to manage performance, which is where Fledge's instancing system comes into play.
Our art department has a catalog of a lot of modular meshes, and we just they just reuse a single mesh 100 or 1,000 times over the course of the whole level. So they just go ahead in Maya, they create the levels in a certain way, so they reuse like floor tiles, they reuse windows, they reuse elements of streets and things like that. And then in the end, it gets imported to Fledge. And that's actually the part where we just take all the stuff that's using the same materials, using the same instance, and we just load the mesh once. And then we got like a really big buffer just with the transformation information. So it's not like you're creating a really huge level and each single vertex is unique, but you simply take a single mesh, there's a buffer with positional information or with transformation information, and this buffer is filled with all the single instances in the level that's being used to render everything.
You can see here in the Fledge editor that it's possible to highlight individual objects and see the associated instances throughout the map. Reusing these mesh chunks when constructing the world saves greatly on resources and helps increase performance. While we're discussing geometry, another interesting element stems from the character models themselves. The Surge 2 focuses on dismemberment, in that you can slice off limbs and use parts from these severed limbs to upgrade your character. As a result, enemies are built from multiple meshes, each with its own properties.
Using our game object and our node system, we can just take those meshes. Those meshes are being animated using the same skeleton as the whole body uses, so they're more or less just linked to the same animated skeleton in the background. And then we just can take our physics system and partially ragdoll simulate the characters. So in case if you just cut the upper body part, just get a ragdoll where the legs are missing, for example, stuff like that.
So that's one other area where the process differs slightly from many other games today. Characters need to be built specifically with dismemberment in mind. And naturally, another part of the building process centers around the materials themselves. A brick wall or a cement floor requires the appropriate materials to appear realistic and natural within the world. Expectedly, Fledge supports physically based materials with variable roughness simulated here in this test room using a generic plastic-like material in this case. It's also possible to create some rather striking material effects using shaders and the like. I just love the appearance of this wet glass. But while the basic materials such as stone, metal, and the like are all properly represented, the variety stems from the team's robust decal system, which is key in transforming, say, a basic cement material into something with more variety and realism. In the original Surge, decals were used for things such as markings on the floor or graffiti, but that's about it, and they were relatively expensive to render.
What we needed to do to render a decal was submitting a draw call to the GPU for every decal, and then rendering a box or something like that which represents the decal, and then running a shader inside that box and blend the decal to the G buffer in that case.
For the sequel, however, the team wanted to utilize decals to create a layering system for materials rather than utilizing the more limited slot-based system used in the original Surge. This basically enables artists to add additional detail to any surface in the game. It was achieved using a feature available in low-level APIs such as D3D12, known as bindless texturing.
Bindless texturing essentially means that we don't need to bind certain resources to a certain shader. So in the past, we render an object, we run a shader on it, and to that shader we bind textures and buffers and stuff like that. But if we want to render a lot of decals at once, we would need to bind all the textures we need for the decals, which can be hundreds and thousands, to that one shader, and that wasn't possible because in that old slot-based system we had just a maximum amount of texture slots we could use. That was just not possible. Nowadays, where we can freely define unbounded descriptor sets, we can just, for example, bind all the textures we have in the game to one single shader and just index that with a single index, and that's essentially what we did. We have this clustered-based lighting system, or clustered deferred lighting system, and we just render all the decals in a very similar fashion to as we render the lights. We essentially do it in the same shader just before the lighting to modify what's getting in from the G buffer stage. So we get all the geometry information, like the albedo, the roughness, the metalness, and all these things for the lighting. But before we pass it to the lighting inside the shader, we modify it using the decals.
So thus far we've examined areas where efficiency is increased. Instancing helps reduce overhead by smartly reusing mesh data, while the decal system is one way in which the Surge 2 leverages the features of modern APIs to improve efficiency. But there's so much more to discuss here, so let's move on to lighting. Lighting is critical in creating a modern 3D game, and achieving some semblance of realism requires graphics programmers to consider the behavior of light itself. Capturing the subtleties of light behaviors such as indirect illumination is computationally expensive, however. So how has Deck 13 tackled this problem? It starts with selecting the right rendering path for your project.
What you have is a clustered deferred lighting system, so we actually use forward plus-esque lighting for transparent objects. And on the other hand, we got our deferred lighting system we just use for the whole static scene geometry, just for everything that's seen on the screen.
Now, before we continue, since this is a clustered deferred render, let's take a quick look at the game's G-buffer setup. What is a G-buffer, you ask? Well, think of it as a buffer used in a deferred render after the geometry pass, in which lighting relevant data is stored for use in the final lighting pass. To demonstrate this setup, here's a scene from Jericho City. We can now walk through each individual part of the G-buffer, from the albedo, the normals, the vertex normals, the metalness, the occlusion, roughness, vertex color, and more. It gives you a better idea of how this scene is lit and shaded by using a combination of these parts. It is standard stuff, of course, but I still think it's fascinating to observe. And this approach allows the team to throw around a larger volume of lights in any single scene, resulting in a more dynamic game world, but there are many different types of lights to be considered, of course.
So, for example, we actually have local lights, we got our global light, or our main light, which is just a direction light, which use cascaded shadow maps. And to actually achieve some sort of indirect illumination, it's different things that we utilize. So for specular reflections, we just got this IBL stuff, image-based lighting stuff, which is being used all over the place.
This, of course, explains how specular reflections are handled. Basically, artists can place probes in a level, capture the scene from different perspectives, save them as a cube map, then use that to render some static reflections which shine on materials such as metal and water. It's a very basic solution for reflections, however, but what's important is that in the original game, these probes were also used for deriving indirect illumination data, basically areas lit from the natural bounce of a primary light. It was not an especially dense grid, however, and thus the information was rather sparse and undetailed. This has changed in the Surge 2.
What we did for the Surge 2 and for our new rendering system in the background is to actually decouple the irradiance information from the specular probes. So we still got manually placed specular probes in the levels, which can be tweaked on outside and placed in an artistic way. But then we got a thing that we call the irradiance grid, which is more or less automated system for placing probes in a level. And this system is actually just filling a huge three-dimensional grid, just taking the collision mesh as a reference in the beginning, and then we use this information to actually decide where we want to spawn the probes. And then in the end, those probes are being processed, captured, and we store all this information as spherical harmonics in a 3D texture, which we can then use for looking up the irradiance information per pixel.
These are just some of the basics on how lighting is handled in the Surge 2, but there are other unique areas to explore. One of the signature visual features that Deck 13 has continued to push is the use of volumetric effects, including lighting, fog, and clouds. These are featured heavily in the Surge 2. So how does it work?
So what we're doing now is attach a 3D volume texture to the camera view. We divide this camera view into into a grid, and then we actually calculate all the volumetrics information in this 3D texture. And this has a lot of benefits because it's three-dimensional information. It's really, really easy to do lookups in the end, which avoid things like fog bleeding over the edges just because of depth discontinuities and stuff like that. And the cool thing about this is, back in the day in the Surge 1, fog and volumetrics were actually two completely different concepts. So the one concept was, okay, you could place a fog volume, but it was not lit. So there was some sort of constant light value hard-coded into a fog volume, which you could tweak on art side. And for the new system, actually, volumetrics and fog are one and the same thing. So in the end, what we have in our engine is we have certain volumes that you can place in the scene. You can define how dense those fog volumes are. You can specify an albedo value, and this is all accumulated into this 3D texture. When those fog volumes are placed, actually we just do the same that we do for our clustered lighting paths per pixel. So for each cell in this volumetric lighting buffer, we just check which lights are contributing to it, adding them up, combining them with the albedo value of the fog volumes, and then in the end you get something where you have fog placed in level, fog that gets illuminated from lights that are placed in a level, and then in the end you end up with something where everything just goes together naturally. And after all this stuff has been accumulated, there's a ray marching step, which is all the same for every frame. It doesn't depend on anything that's going on in the scene, so it's more or less a constant coast where you just traverse the ray, accumulate the stuff that's going on in the accumulation buffer, and then in the end you end up with volumetric lighting on it.
But if you look to the sky, you'll notice an additional use of volumetrics, the cloud simulation.
So at the beginning of Surge 2, we actually had this concept art with a big thing in the sky. And actually the volumetric clouds were not something we had in the back of our heads from the start. So it was more something where we experimented on tech side to help the art department reach their goal. So for the volumetric clouds, it's something that's more or less pretty simple. It's a really, really small texture, I guess quarter resolution if I'm not mistaken at the moment. And in this case, it's just combining a lot of noise textures together, animating them, and then there's some simple ray marching involved to generate those clouds.
The benefit here is that, like the volumetric fog, clouds are completely unified into the lighting system. So if you change the main light direction, the skylight, or elevation of the sun, the clouds directly respond to the changes. All of this comes together, enabling the artists to utilize these effects across every map in the game. As a post-apocalyptic city, the air is thick and filthy, and the way the sun penetrates this atmosphere contributes greatly to the overall visual package. It just looks fantastic. But for fans of particle showers and moving foliage, this next section may prove even more enlightening. One of the central visual ingredients in any modern 3D game today is its particle system.
The particle system is basically used for every kind of special effect in the video game. So all the blood, all the lightning, all the fire, all those shiny explosions and blood spatters when you dismember your enemies, all of that comes from the particle system.
With so many of these effects in the game then, the particle system needed to be fast and reliable.
This time we decided to extend it a bit, not just port it.
The Surge already features a GPU-based particle system that was effective, but the team took things further for the sequel.
So basically the trails before were still rendered on the CPU side, and then just had a separate path to be drawn on the GPU. And right now everything is just unified. So we just decided, okay, let's just put everything together. We have a GPU particle system, which is fast. Let's just do it all there.
So how does it all work then?
So the way the particle system basically works is we want to spawn a bunch of little particles at a specified rate. So 200 particles per second, or we can also do them in bursts. So 50 being burst every 2 seconds or something like that. And how this works is they have an initial velocity and rotation and a bunch of other properties that the artists can actually configure, which gives them the way they behave when they just get shot from a specific point. So then they are shot and they can be affected by a bunch of forces, and that's where the vector fields, for example, get into account. They are basically just a volume that you put your particles inside, and they give them some velocity or some damping, so just trying to shift them on their way. So when you have those explosions in the Surge 2 and you see a bunch of little sparks flying around and they get some really crazy like trajectories and stuff like that, all of that is being done by vector fields, which is just affecting their trajectory.
The result of all this is a fireworks show of particles used throughout the game, and it just looks excellent in motion, adding greatly to the combat and the atmosphere. Speaking of atmosphere, while the Surge 2 focuses on its urban landscape primarily, certain areas of the world are rich in greenery, and it's here where another new system is introduced: Strand-based foliage. The idea is that grass and plants move realistically as you walk through them, and can be sliced into pieces. So what was the driver behind this idea in the first place?
For every project, there's a point where we search for things that can aid gameplay. It's not always something that has to be actually related to the gameplay, but there are things that are either graphically or physically that can aid the smooth feeling of the gameplay. So in the past we had, and even currently we are using cloth, for example, on characters. They always tend to smoothen out animation just because there's something attached to a character that's just moving as soon as you do something. So it really feels natural and fluid. And I guess that's the same thing that drove us in the direction of creating something in our forest-like level that aids the gameplay there. So in this level there are actually those hunters which can cloak themselves, and we thought about what would be cool to support this. And then in the back of our hands was like, okay, it would be cool if we have high grass. We wanted to use those that you can actually see where the characters are moving.
In the past, foliage interaction was done using something like a static noise function to simply bend the grass object as you move through it, but for the Surge 2, the team has switched instead to a strand-based system.
The strand-based system is more or less just a couple of particles which are attached to each other, and then we skin our vegetation meshes to those particles. And then there's a simple CPU-based simulation running in the background which just tries to keep those particles which are used for the strands in certain constraints. And that's actually all there is to it. So we just collect all this information like characters being close to a certain particle, and then we use this information to add movement to the simulation itself.
Even better, artists can use a tool within Fledge to basically place grass freely around any map, as if using a paintbrush almost. Everything is handled using this voxel grid, which you can see visualized here in the editor. Once placed, you can drop right into the map and start testing. It's all very seamlessly integrated and designed for agile development. But if we step back for a moment, thus far we've examined many different techniques and features created for the Surge 2. You've had a look at the Fledge editor itself and hopefully gained an understanding of how maps are created and lit. We've examined the decal system, which lends environments greater variety while bringing that lived-in feeling to the world. We've seen the particle system in action, the strand-based foliage, the volumetric lighting, and more. But there's one other major feature that we haven't touched on yet, and that is anti-aliasing. One of the chief complaints with the original Surge stems entirely from its approach to anti-aliasing. Using the post-process SMAA technique, edges were reasonably clean, but in-surface aliasing ran rampant, resulting in lots of shimmering. It's a problem that the team wanted to solve for the sequel, and the solution to this problem is Temporal anti-aliasing, or TAA.
To get a first version of TAA running is pretty easy. So what you essentially do is jitter the projection matrix on each frame. So you slightly move the virtual camera of the game for certain pixels to the left, to the right, to the top and down. And later you stitch these images together. So that's basically the whole idea about it.
This could get pretty technical. There's a lot of ground to cover.
The problem with that is when you have a still image which looks great, so you can get this in a couple of days or maybe in a day. That's rather easy and it looks good. But then when things starts moving, things also start falling apart, because when we stitch together multiple images, we need to know where to put each pixel. And to know that, we need to so-called reproject the pixels from the previous frames to the current frame. And if we would only move the camera, that would also be easy, because the movement of the camera is totally defined by the camera matrix. And we have two matrices, like the one from the previous frame and the one from the current frame, plus the current depth buffer. We could just reproject that. The problem is then, the camera is not the only thing in the game which is moving. So we also have moving grass, we have moving characters which are skinned, we have moving textures, we have a lot of things like that. And once you start to target these problems, things get hairy.
So what does it take to actually fix this?
To get TAA to a I would say playable state, you first need to get your motion vectors right. So a motion vector is for each pixel, how much did a pixel move from the last frame to the current frame. And this should involve all the movement in the scene you have, especially for skinned characters and things which are not only based on camera movement. Once you have the motion vector buffer, you can reproject the so-called history buffer, like the accumulated frames of the past. You can reproject that to the current frame, and you get a rather anti-aliased image. But the problem is you introduce blurriness, and probably you introduce ghosting. And ghosting and blurriness is nothing you want really to have. You want to have both a sharp image and you want an anti-aliased image, and that's always. I always see it like a slider, and for each pixel I need to decide where is the slider. Is it more sharp and potentially jittery, or is it more anti-aliased but potentially blurry? So that's always, and for each pixel we need to decide where to put that slider. And we need to derive as much as possible from the scene what we already have. So for example, there's a technique named history clamping, which works quite well to avoid 95% of the ghosting in the scene. I think it was introduced by some Unreal rendering programmers a couple of years ago, and then people improved upon that. But the basic principle is that we compute in the 3x3 neighborhood of the current pixel, we compute the minimum and the maximum color, which basically spans an AABB in the RGB space, and we try to put the current history pixel, the current history color into that box, which just means we clamp the current history color between the minimum and the maximum of the current 3x3 neighborhood, which works quite well. But then you get more issues. For example, if you have a character moving, and from one frame to the other, you're revealing new pixels which were not visible before. So what are you doing with that? Or what are you doing with very slowly moving pixels? For example, a character in its idle state. It's introducing a lot of blurriness. So we have a lot of measurements, like how fast is a pixel moving, how is the color or the luminance of a pixel compared to its neighbors, and all these metrics are used to determine exactly this slider for each pixel. And that's actually the hard part of it, because you see an issue on the screen, you fix that, but then something else breaks. And this is really tedious to get it right, to find a good measurement which works for all the pixels.
But in the end, they did find a good solution. The TAA implementation in the Surge 2 is well done overall. It breaks if you know where to look at it like most others, but it's a huge step up from the SMAA featured in the original game. That said, at the time of this video, TAA has only launched on PC and Xbox One due to a bug in the PS4 version. That should be fixed soon, however, but it shows you how down to the wire these features can be when developing a game. And this isn't even everything. Like the original, the Surge 2 ships with an impressively small footprint as well. With games often requiring huge amounts of storage, the Surge 2 weighs in at just 15 gigabytes on PC and half that on consoles. So how is that achieved?
One of the things that we always try to not go over the top with things. So actually when we are heading into a project, we always try to be really careful and learn from the mistakes we did in the past, right? And one of the things is we would never go ahead and just create awfully large textures just to make it look perfect if you get really, really close to it. And since we're always creating our own technology, it's always where we have to see which systems are available, which system will make sense for the project, and do we really need to create the systems, or can we just be a little bit more careful on content and asset side? It's not like we tend to keep the file sizes down on intent, but it's more like from how we work and how we have to handle our projects, it's more like we have to be careful on content side, and we have to make sure that there's nothing that just is breaking us the neck in the end.
At this point, we have a rather reasonable understanding of what the team has been able to achieve here. The Surge 2 is not without its flaws, of course, but this is a meaty game built entirely from homegrown technology, and I feel that's something to celebrate. But what does the future look like for Fledge?
So I guess for Fledge and for the future, we always have a lot of stuff in the back of our minds. So one more or less simple thing is that our levels are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So for the future, we actually want to get away from the concept of having one level, which is really big and really dense, to something that's having a little bit more broad perspective. So we never had a height map system, for example, so that's something we want to improve upon in the future, to not rely on baked meshes for terrain information, for example. And other than that, we are always searching for new ways to improve tools and general workflows. So when we think about stuff like ray tracing, for us it's not that important to think about it as, oh, we can have the nicest real-time reflections in the world. It's more like, when we think about it, it's more like we can improve our tools and provide instant feedback for, let's say, the baking of indirect lighting information, for example.
I hope you've enjoyed this tour of Deck 13 and the Fledge engine, and have gained a deeper understanding of what it takes to bring a game like the Surge 2 to life.
We've covered a lot in this video, but of course this is just a small subset of the overall effort that goes into producing a game like the Surge 2. For me, it's inspirational to see a small, passionate team like the crew at Deck 13 working together for so long, improving and learning from each project. Just 10 years ago, Deck 13 was relatively unknown in the larger gaming space, but slowly the studio has carved out its own little niche, delivering large, challenging games like the Surge 2. So, what's next for the studio? We don't know what the next project will be, of course, but having shipped 3 games on current generation platforms, Deck 13 is in a great position for next generation development, and I can't wait to see what they come up with next. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this rather lengthy video. If you enjoyed it though, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell at the top for more updates from Digital Foundry, and find us over on Twitter. Thanks for watching.